Hello and welcome to AWB's webinar. Today's topic is property tax levy reform. And with us today
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
For education funding and their outcomes. Our goal today is to understand why levy reform is important, to learn about legislation under consideration, and most importantly, to answer your questions. Representative Chad Magendanz is the Republican ranking member on the House Education Committee. He also serves on the Appropriations and Technology and Economic Development Committees. He is a former president of the Issaquah School Board and has served as an officer in the Navy, so he should have some great insight for us with that background. Senator Mark Mullet serves as the ranking Democrat member on the Financial Institutions and Insurance Committee. He's also a member of the Rules and Early Learning and K-12 Education Committee. In addition, Mark serves on the Joint Legislative Audit Review Committee. He's also a former councilman in the city of Issaquah and owns two small businesses in Issaquah, Zeke's Pizza and Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream, and is a member of AWB. So, as you think of questions during the next half hour, please type them into the dialog box on the right, and we'll answer them after the presentation of both Representative Magendanz and Senator Mullet. To begin with, I just want to make sure everyone has an understanding of the problem that is facing us today. Washington State's Constitution provides that it is the paramount duty of the state to make ample provision for the education of all children residing within its border. A short sentence, but with many, many impacts as we're dealing with the McCleary decision and other funding matters before the state legislature. If you've heard of the McCleary decision, the essence of it really gets down to the fact that the Supreme Court will allow the legislature to define an instructional program of basic education for schools, but they must amply fund it from a regular and dependable source, and that is a significant challenge for lawmakers this current session. As we look at our overall tax obligation for property taxes, Washington is right about in the middle of the pack. We're number 28 in the nation, and we've been there consistently for the last several decades. And there are several bills before the legislature dealing with levy reform, whether it's emergency medical services, hospital districts, regional transit authorities. The bill we want to talk about today is Senate Bill 5334, which is the bill that Senator Mark Mullet has introduced to address the school levy issues while increasing and decreasing property tax to fund education. So Mark's going to describe what exactly that entails, and we'll go ahead and hand over to Mark to describe your legislation.
Okay. Is this guy working right now?
Should be up right now.
Oh, there you go. Cool. You can go one more slide over then. So in terms of levy reform, the idea is, you have money that comes from the state, property tax to help pay for schools. You also have money that comes in from the local level to also pay for schools. And so a lot of the ideas around the teachers right now, their compensation, if the average teacher, let's say, is making $55,000 a year, 45 of that's coming from the state, 10 of it's coming from the locals. And so the theory is there a way we can take this local money, which every 4 years people can vote down, and make it permanent so the state is actually paying for the majority, if not all, of the teacher compensation expenses. And in terms of the theory is the money is currently there. It's just a chunk of it's coming from the local level, not from the state level. Is there a bill we could pass that redirects that local money to the state level without raising your taxes and still ensuring it's going to the local teachers in your local district to pay and help compensate them? So you can go on to the next slide, please. Okay, and yeah, I'm calling this a no new taxes solution in the sense that this is if you're a homeowner and your property tax right now is $2,000 on your house, and this bill were to pass, your property tax would not change. It's just instead of your $2,000 having, let's say, $500 would go to the local level and $1,500 to other purposes, you might end up with only $300 going to the local level and $1,700 going to other purposes. You would still net be paying the exact same amount of money. So we're talking about doing a $1 per thousand shift on your property tax bill where it goes from the local to the state level, but then we're also reducing the amount you can get charged locally to make sure that net the average homeowner doesn't see a change in their property tax bill. So the amount that you're making permanent right now is $2 billion. So the state roughly is raising $4 billion a budget cycle through local levies. This only addresses half of that, and the reason you can really only address half of that is at the $2 billion level, you're capturing 99.9% of the school districts in the state charge at least $1 per thousand in local levy for their operating expenses. If you start to go to a higher amount, you're going to hit a lot of districts that don't charge that amount, so it gets a little bit tricky. So this is the way you could basically find the amount that almost every district in the entire state is currently charging and switch that amount to a permanent state source of funding without raising anybody's taxes. We can go one more. So this isn't obviously the only levy idea that is out there. There's a variety of ideas that have been proposed in the last 5 to 10 years. And the reason for the focus for me on this one is this idea makes sure that everything you voted for at the local level for your local schools is going to stay with your local schools. Because if you redistribute the money based on assessed value, that's how you currently collect at the local level. So it ensures that the formula is making every district whole. And so, you know, as you look at the slide here, there's no shift. It's not like you're taking money from the Puget Sound area and shifting it elsewhere in the state. So there's no redistribution of high property, you know, value areas in the state to the lower property value areas. And the other important element of the proposal I have, which some people like and some people hate, is the fact that you're not changing the local control of these dollars. So even though you're going to redistribute them from the state, they're kind of going to be more in the form of block grants, where the districts still have flexibility and control over how they choose to spend that money. And that part, you know, the districts like that part. There's other people that don't like that part. They want the state to feel like they have more control over this money. And in terms of how I approach it politically, it's just a question of how many political hurdles you can jump over on one individual bill. And districts really start to get nervous when you take away how they spend their local levy dollars. And so it's kind of biting the apple one piece at a time. The first piece is you make it permanent. Down the road, if you want to try to figure out how you control that money more, I think you can have that discussion. But I think to try to get something accomplished this session, you have to be careful how much you try to chew in one bite. The other final piece, I guess that third bullet point is there's a lot of proposals that even though you do the $1 swap, they would, so it doesn't change your property tax bill this year, they will enable the local districts to turn around the following year and ask for additional money. And so this bill doesn't allow that to happen. It says the following year, the local districts have, their local levy authority has been reduced by that dollar. So if they were at their cap before, they're still at their cap. If they weren't at their cap before, they still have the same authority they had before the bill was passed. But it takes away, it's not raising the cap of what they can get locally. It's still the same amount. I think that's a quick summary of my ideas. And it's a very simple approach. And like I said, it's got people on both sides that aren't comfortable with it, but that's what I'm hoping to have the discussion about.
So let's go ahead and hand it over to Chad Magendanz to give us a little bit more background on what exactly the problems we're facing and some of the challenges on reading through this proposal.
Well, the levy swap idea is one that's been around for a while. Senator Zarelli had a similar bill back in 2007-2008 biennium. There was the Eisminger plan, which is effectively a levy swap as well. Rob McKenna, it was a major part of his strategy to fund education in his gubernatorial campaign. And Russ Hunter is actually on the road talking about this quite a bit. And so we've actually come a long way in our thinking along these lines. And what's framed the discussion is the requirements for satisfying the McCleary ruling. Because folks on both sides of the aisle, both sides of the rotunda, we want to put McCleary to bed. You know, we don't want this hanging over our heads for the next generation. And in order to do that, we need to come up with a solution that not just reduces our dependency on local levies to pay for our program of basic education, but really eliminates it. We need to be able to stand in front of the courts and say, we are fully funding our program of basic education with no reliance whatsoever on local levies to pay the bill. And so to kind of set the frame for how we set up that claim, we need to kind of take a hard look at how we're spending our money right now. So if you look at property taxes, during the calendar year 2014, you've got a pretty significant portion that's already dedicated to schools. And in fact, if you look at 2014, it's about 56%. 36% is going to your local levies, for your local school districts, and 20% is going to the state to pay for what we call the Common Schools Levy, and that's our property tax, which is limited to $3.60 per thousand of assessed value. Now, if you look historically, you can see that 56%, it's averaged 55%. It has stayed very steady when you combine both the state and the local shares of the property tax. The difference, as you can see from the bottom there, is that the state's portion has been eroded, and we've basically been shifting that burden to the local school districts. You know, our goal with our McCleary remedy is to set that straight and to undo the past 30 years of history that's been shifting for more local taxes. You can see how this happened too. I mean, when originally we made in the Duran 2 decision, which was our last major reform, we had set local school levies down to a 10% levy limit. And over the years, you can see how it's grown to 20%, to 24%, and then during the recent recession, we bumped it up temporarily to 28%. However, that provision sunsets in 2008. We're going to have what we call the levy cliff, where it's going to bump back down to 24%. And some of the provisions we kept in place to kind of keep these ghost dollars in place that gave credit to school districts for Initiative 732 COLAs and Initiative 728 class size initiatives, those will disappear as well. So we've got a bit of a forcing function coming up to ensure we remedy this problem for school districts before they see a pretty significant impact to the bottom line. So if you look at how districts are spending their local levy dollars, again, you come up with this 55%. They're basically putting 55% of their local levies into additional classified salaries, administrative salaries, the teachers, and this is a pretty significant portion of the money they're collecting. They're basically backfilling what we're not paying at the state level. And if you look historically at what teachers are paid, and this is the statewide average, you can see that we've consistently been adding to teachers' salaries, but more and more of the share of what's paid to teachers is coming from local sources. So this year, the average salary for a teacher, when you combine state and local funding, is $66,000. That's the average. Now, I want to point out that the compensation technical working group reports, things like that, have never indicated that we're inadequately funding our teachers. It's just that the source of the funding is inappropriate. And so our goal is to remedy that and not put a whole bunch of new money in. And so a lot of us argue that a shift is appropriate. We just need to change the source of this funding, not have a major difference in how we're compensating teachers. So there's also quite a disparity when you look district to district. Yes, if you look back at this slide, yet what's it? $12.7%, or sorry, $12,787 are on average paid by local districts, but it varies quite a bit depending on where your district is. You can see, at some extremes we have districts that have no local enhancements. It's just state funding. And on the opposite extreme, we've got Everett, which has, it's almost $85,000 that teachers are being paid in Everett because they're putting $26,000 of local enhancements on top of what they're being paid by the state. So there's a great amount of inequity. And yet, if you look at the reports that were given to the Compensation Technical Working Group, this may seem inequitable, but really it turns out there's a very close alignment to what the cost of living is in those areas. Now, there are outliers like Everett, but if you look at the Puget Sound area, those are the areas that are having high supplemental pay from local districts. It's because the cost of living is significantly higher in the Puget Sound region, and so it's not at all unreasonable that districts are getting real creative in finding ways to provide a competitive salary in their regions. So one of the things that's been an assumption we've been working with in our four corner meetings for a McCleary remedy is that whatever we do, we have to have a solution that provides a competitive salary no matter where the school is. And that's going to vary depending on the amenities and the local cost of living in that region. So really, that's framed the discussion. And so what we're talking about right now is a levy swap, much like what Mark's proposing. It's a little bit more significant because we can't just chip away at the contribution from local school districts. We have to eliminate it entirely for what our program of basic education is. So we're talking about approximately $3 billion per biennium that would be part of the levy swap. Most of that would go into a local labor market adjustment. Basically, it's replacing what school districts are doing in their supplemental pay. They call them tri-dollars. Originally, they started out as additional time and responsibility that were pure local enhancements to program of basic education, but what they've turned into is this local labor market adjustment. So we're recognizing that now, and we're putting that money into more funding that will come from the state to these high cost of living areas, and that will allow districts to provide a competitive salary in that region. Now, to pay for it, just like in Mark's case, we're raising our common schools levy. In my proposal, it's by another $1.15. And so when you raise it by $1.15, you're seeing high assessed value areas, which, not coincidentally correspond to the high cost of living areas. They're putting more money in, but they're also getting more money back. And so it ends up being almost a net wash for those areas. They're putting more money in, they're getting more money back. Their school levies are now returned to them. Instead of spending 55% of their school levies for supplementing basic education, they can spend them on purely enhancements, which is really what they were designed for. And so now that levy authority is freed up to do things that they would like to do locally. It's not part of the program of basic education, but it may be important to that community, and if they want to fund it, they should have the right to. So we're looking at 3 different ways of bringing the local levies down. The first is just to keep the current system. We just drop it down by a certain percentage, maybe drop it down to 24 as it would naturally do. The second is we tie it to a more stable base. We rebase it. One of the problems we've had in the past is that if you cut state and federal funding, you inadvertently cut local levy authority too. So for every dollar the federal government or the state cuts to school funding, we lose about 30 cents of authority that locals can collect. We don't want the double whammy there. And so tying it to a more stable base like the BEA, so the basic education allocation, which is the core basic education funding, that's the last thing that's going to be cut. That will allow more stable levy authority for the districts. And the third thing that we're looking at is just going with a flat levy cap. So if we reduced, if you look at the statewide average, it's about $3.60 per thousand that we're paying for local levies, and that's average throughout the state, and it varies a lot. Some are a lot more than that, some are a lot less. If we drop that to a straight $2 per thousand levy limit, we actually will reduce local taxes in the areas that have the lowest assessed value the most. Those areas that are really sensitive to property taxes, because in those areas, some of them are up upwards of $40 per $1,000 assessed value in local levies. I mean, these are insane. You got low value property, and they're just, as a percentage of what their property is worth, it's much higher. And yet you have areas like Seattle and Bellevue that are paying a little bit over $1. So if we level everybody at $2, it ends up that Bellevue and Seattle actually have additional levy authority that they could use, that they would have reserved. I mean, they would still have to get that approved by their local constituents, but they have additional money that they could spend because, frankly, the same program rolled out in Seattle is going to cost more than it would cost other places. And so that seems fair on the surface, at least. And in those areas that are more sensitive to their tax burden, we want to make sure that we're reducing their tax burden from local school districts. So that's really where we're headed. We've got a lot of plans right now. I'm not at liberty to basically discuss most of them, but with the budget release that's happening as we speak, I think you're going to see the focus shift from following through in our budget with our current commitments for House Bill 2776, which is like $1.5 billion of new money for K-3 class size enhancements, MSOC, all-day kindergarten, and the focus is going to go over to solving the last piece of McCleary, which is this compensation and levy reform piece. It'll be a separate bill, but we will find a funding mechanism very similar to what you've heard today, and we're trying to find a fair mechanism to ensure that there aren't any big winners or losers, that everyone comes out ahead.
So I think it's time for us to go to questions. Carly is going to moderate those questions for us, but let's go ahead and kick it off with just a basic one. Both of you have mentioned different proposals, different ideas. Is there an opportunity to get this done this session? Mark?
I mean, I think that the challenge, what I'm most nervous about blocking it is any district that is going to have less money come back to them what they currently collect is going to be opposed to any change. So even if that amount they get reduced by is only 10%, so let's say they're collecting 10 million locally, and now in the new system, the state's going to give them 9 million for compensation, regional compensation adjustments. Those districts will throw a fit, I think, over the loss of that $1 million, and I think it's going to be tough to jump over that political hurdle in the remaining months. So I'm nervous about any solution that gives districts less money through their local revenue sources than what they're currently receiving. And that, I think, is going to be the real challenge of how you get to the finish line in the before April 26th.
Chad, about you?
Can we come up with a solution? We must come up with a solution. We're under a court order right now. We've been found in contempt of not having a plan in place to implement a McCleary remedy. And so, it's not an option, I believe. If we don't do our job this legislative session, we'll be back working out another budget and another, levy compensation proposal because the courts will find it unconstitutional. So we might as well get this right the first time. We have to do that. As for the districts that might actually lose out in this, I agree. Politically, that's untenable that if we even have, a small percentage of districts that are coming out less than they were before, politically, that's very hard to sell. And so what we have is a hold harmless strategy, and we have this this funding mechanism for levy equalization already in existence, and the idea would be to repurpose that to make sure that every district comes out ahead.
So just a reminder to type your questions into the dialog box on the right. And Carly, you want to go ahead and read us some?
How do you keep local levies from funding aspects of the model school instead of just enhancements?
That's a great question.
Right.
So these tri-dollars, the tri-pay addition that was intended for time responsibility, that's on top of the form-based education, those got co-opted. And they did it very cleverly because if you actually look at state statute right now, districts aren't allowed to spend more on compensation than what they're allocated by the state. And you think that would stop this from happening, but there's a specific carve-out for the TRI program. And that's how it got co-opted. And so we've taken a look at that language. And one of my bills, it's a proposed new compensation plan, you can take a look at the language we proposed to really trim that back, to be very explicit about what TRI dollars can be spent for, and that no local levies can be used to supplement the pay for programs of basic education. And we're going to be very strict about that, and there will be consequences, funding consequences, if districts try to do this, because this is really what's led to the levy creep that got us in this situation.
Mark, do you agree with that, or do you have different thoughts?
I mean, it's a tough problem to solve is the short answer. And one of the real, and this is sort of a macro challenge of what the courts put us in is, I'm from Seattle, but when I worked in New York, I lived in New England, for 5 years. And every state in the country that has a high level of per pupil funding has a massive reliance on local levy money. Because the reality is we're much more comfortable voting to tax ourselves when we know it's going to stay with our local schools and just go off to this general area where we're not sure it's going to benefit our own kids or benefit our own property values of the home that we currently live in. And so I think this is going to be the ultimate challenge is we're, at the end of the day, we're removing the ability to raise, the easiest way for us to raise money is at the local level, whether it's paying for a local park or paying for our local school. And as we take that away, it's going to be tough, to tell these districts, hey, you're not allowed to use any of this money to try to help pay for your teachers. And it's going to be a real challenge, I think, politically between now and the end of the session to get over that. And I don't know. That's why I think in my proposal, it's trying not to be too prescriptive, saying you still get to use that money if you decide, like, you want to give your teachers that extra local dollars, like, that's completely within your right to do it. But the court, Chad has a very valid point. Like, if the court still could make accusations saying we're not fully meeting our obligations, and so that'll be an interesting dialogue of how you do it.
I have a feeling that regardless of what we do, we're probably not done with the courts interpreting the legislative actions. Carly, next question.
Do you believe the property tax levy reform proposal is a viable way to fund education?
Mark.
I do. I mean, I think Chad and I, where we completely agree is there's money there right now. It's just the money that, this local money, the Supreme Court's pointing out every 4 years, these voters can vote it down. And it doesn't seem like the best way to fund your school system. It can go away in 4 years at the whim of the voters. So I think making these dollars more permanent without actually trying to raise additional money is a very viable solution to helping, address the McCleary decisions that are upon us. And I think this is the right path to be going down, the local levy reform.
I agree. We've got three options, really. The first is that we we raise taxes. And frankly, there's just no appetite to do that right now. We're just starting an economic recovery, and the taxes that are proposed, capital gains, carbon taxes, aren't the taxes I would choose to fund education because I'm looking for something that's stable. Capital gains are one of the most volatile taxes around because the market naturally shifts from year to year. Carbon taxes are intended to decline over time, just like the gas tax, and so I want something that's stable that's going to be here for a whole generation of kids. And so I tend to go back to the property tax. I mean, it's called the Common Schools Levy for a reason. And that brings the second option, which is to basically reallocate taxes. And that's I think, the sweet spot here. The third option, which is also untenable, I think, is we just start cutting programs. And, to make $3 billion worth of cuts, I just don't think there's the appetite for that either. So this is a natural common ground. It's a good compromise approach to solving problems.
Since levy reform only addresses part of the McCleary decision, are there other reforms that should be adopted?
Start with you, Chad.
Well, of course. Yes, there was the one line in the McCleary ruling that I gravitated to again and again, which says, necessary reforms are needed. Pouring more money into an outmoded system will not succeed. Yeah, we tend to focus on the funding because that's a very critical piece of this. But I also want to see that our funding is used more effectively in our system. Take the compensation system, for example. I mean, we're approaching one element of the compensation plan for teachers by looking at local labor market adjustments, but we also need to look at how we're differentiating how we pay teachers. Right now, we differentiate how we pay teachers based on their seniority and by their advanced degrees, neither of which has good correlation with student outcomes. In fact, National Council for Teacher Quality did an analysis of 102 independent studies that looked at the correlation between advanced degrees and student outcomes and found that 90% of them had no correlation with positive student outcomes or had a negative correlation with student outcomes. And of the 10% that actually did show some correlation, it was typically in a secondary, so a high school situation, where a teacher, like a physics teacher or a math teacher, got a master's degree in physics or math, not went back and got a master's in education. So right now we're putting a whole lot of money to encourage teachers to spend a whole lot of money into stuff that really doesn't have much impact. And so let's be thoughtful about that process. Let's put some money into attracting teachers into hard-to-staff areas. Things like special education, ELL, our English language learners, computer science, where we have just chronic problems attracting talented teachers to those areas. Let's put money into attracting teachers into those highly desired positions. Let's take a look at where the seniority matters. Most research shows that seniority plateaus in effectiveness after about 6 to 10 years. And yet, if you look at all the step increases we have for our teachers, a lot of those are pushed out to the end of the career where frankly, the curve's declining. And so, that's partly an artifact of, who actually negotiates these teacher contracts. They're typically the most senior teachers, and so I can understand how we got to this place. But let's step back and look at what's best for kids and create a compensation system that aligns with the best results.
So Mark, I'm sure you've got a few ideas on this topic of other reforms.
Well, and I think that, one of the things to make clear is if we do the levy reform, obviously we have to put the extra $1 billion+ in to actually lower class size and do all-day kindergarten. And I think there's bipartisan agreement that'll happen when we leave town. And so it's a combination. You need the real money. You need this. In terms of the reforms, the idea that's always struck me, that's connected with me the most is kind of what Finland did. And their approach was to really raise the bar of what it took to get an education degree from their university system. And then, so they're trying to attract the highest caliber people to go into the profession. You then, I think Chad would agree, you have to raise the starting salary a little for those people when they come out. But once you get better people in, then you don't have to worry about, micromanaging in the classroom near as much. And that was the experience that Finland went through. And I think the more we start to do that, like when I went to Indiana University, the business school had a 3.3 GPA requirement. The ed school was 2.7. And you find that right now at Washington State University, you have GPA requirements to get in the veterinarian program, but education is open enrollment. Anyone can go in. And so, we're not doing enough, I think, on the front end to make sure that people who go into this profession are the highest caliber people. But part of that is going to be raising the starting pay for teachers. But I think if you start to combine those things, that's the reform for me that really starts to connect.
You mean it's not just about summer vacation?
And we have been making some progress in that area. For a long time, the average SAT scores of kids going into the College of Education have been declining. In the past few years, it's actually gone up considerably. Unfortunately, our output from our College of Education has been declining. So we've been increasing quality, decreasing capacity, and frankly, looking at the number of classrooms we need to fill for the K-3 class size reductions, we need a lot of new teachers very quickly. So we need to make sure we increase our capacity without decreasing the quality.
So this gets a little tricky as you look into the court decision a little bit more. It talks about not making reforms for the sake of saving money, but for student outcomes. How do you see that interfering with your ability to adopt levy reforms, or does it interfere?
I think it's a fair requirement. I think they just don't want us to say, you know, we're going to meet this demand by basically cutting programs. I mean, so I think it's a reasonable expectation, and I think you can accomplish that goal within their guidelines.
Yeah, if you have a funding mismatch, one way is to increase the funding, one way is to shrink the box.
Right.
They don't want to shrink the box for spurious reasons. But we've been a lot better
But
about
that legitimate outcome reasons,
Yes.
you have the full approval of the courts to make those changes as needed.
And one site I would suggest all your members take a look at is the Washington State Institute of Public Policy. They've done a lot of data-driven work about not only the return on investment for every dollar spent in these different types of programs, but also the likelihood of a net positive outcome. So how well you can bet on this working.
Right.
And they've done it in a way that you can really do an apples-to-apples comparison between all the different ways you can spend money for K-12 education. And that's one of the reasons that we were resistant to adopting 1351 at first, because we already have $1.5 billion dedicated to decreasing class sizes in kindergarten through third grade. And the research that
That's
WSIP
built
did,
into the model school.
that's already enacted statute.
Right.
That's going to happen unless somebody changes the law. To go beyond third grade, though, the WSIP guys they looked at 53 independent studies, and they just saw a dramatic drop-off at third grade. And really, there are a lot of other ways we can spend that money to greater effect than decreasing class size beyond third grade. And that's why we initially put the money into K through 3 class size reductions.
Right.
But because we got that data now, because we got those 53 independent studies, I think we have a legitimate basis for going to the courts and saying, this is how we would rather spend the money. And if we have data to support it, I don't see why they wouldn't support that.
Perfect. Carly, next question.
Could you please reintroduce the speakers for those who missed the first couple minutes?
Perfect. Representative Chad Magendanz is the Republican ranking member on the House Education Committee, serves on Appropriations Committee and the Technology and Economic Development Committee, former president of the Issaquah School Board, and an officer in the Navy. Mark Mullet, AWB member with Zeke's Pizza and Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream. Got to make it fit.
I appreciate that.
Former Issaquah City Councilman, also serves as the ranking Democrat member on the Financial Institutions Committee, serves on the Rules Committee and Early Learning and K-12 Committee. Thank you.
And besides money, what is the biggest obstacle to having exceptional outcomes for students in Washington education?
Let's start with you, Mark.
I mean, I'll go back to that same theme. I think it's all about the quality of people coming out of the college system who are about to become teachers. I think you got to focus all your energy on getting the smartest people in front of the classroom as possible, and you design a system that's going to incentivize those smart kids to go into this profession. And I think once you get smart people in the front of the classroom, you don't have to micromanage. And I think that is the ultimate goal of, and like I mentioned before, I think what Finland's kind of shown the world is that model works, and I think the more we can direct resources that direction, I think it'll benefit our kids.
Your thoughts?
And I agree. It's all about getting a highly effective teacher at the front of every classroom. Now, there's a burden, I think, to us to make sure that as teachers start to get the support they need through mentorship programs, even peer reviews, those kind of things, that feedback is important, especially in the formative years.
Right.
And to some extent, we need to have objective measures for how they're performing as well, which is why you've got the big debate right now about using student growth data as part of the teacher evaluation. The flip side of that, though, is that once a teacher has established that they're a highly effective teacher, get out of their way. Let them do their job and let them try to share as much of what they've learned with the other teachers who are ramping up to be more effective too. A lot of times we tend to insert ourselves when it's not needed. I believe in intervention at appropriate times as early as possible. And so those first few years with a teacher, just as they're learning the trade, are the most critical.
Perfect.
And what obligation should be placed on society to fund education? How do you engage the public?
I mean, I think, to be honest, they're doing their fair share right now. I mean, they're paying a fair amount of taxes already to fund education, and so I think they are doing their part, and I don't think we're talking about any massive wholesale changes in how people pay taxes in the state of Washington. I think we're nibbling around the edges here, and the economic growth that we've had in our state has been great. I mean, it's enabling us to put almost $1 billion extra into the schools without having to change anyone's tax rates. And like, if we do the levy reform that we're discussing here, it's another way to address the problem without raising taxes. So, I think people are doing their part in the state of Washington right now.
Yeah, we've got wide bipartisan support for investing in education, and we have the strongest constitutional language of any state, too. That helps us. Whether you support investing in education because you believe it's important for social justice and closing the achievement gap, or if you believe it's all about creating an educated, effective, competitive workforce, I mean, pick your reason, but support it, and I think we've got broad support on both sides of the aisle.
Perfect. So closing thoughts, Mark.
I think, I do think that, as Chad said, I think to solve this problem in terms of, when people say we need to address teacher compensation, and they're like, we don't have the resources, just put an extra $2 or $3 billion in to adjust teacher salaries so the state's paying everything they're currently receiving. I think our only option is to look at some sort of levy reform that's going to shift the money they're receiving from the local level, have it come from the state level, and since raising $2 or $3 billion of taxes for teacher compensation isn't an option, this by default becomes our only option. And the courts made it clear they want us to do something. I think we have to figure out how to solve this problem, and the sooner the better.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to honoring our priorities here. The priorities are clear, but it takes some political courage to do it. We've got great support among the four corners when it comes to education champions right now. So whether House or Senate, Republican or Democrat, we have people who are very well aligned on what we need to do. The challenge is going to be when we go back to our caucuses and we talk to the rest of our members who may not be as educated on these issues. We need to encourage them to do the right thing, to really put the principles above maybe some political risk. I mean, it takes political courage to do the right thing, even if not every school district comes out ahead. We've got outliers in our system right now, some pretty extreme outliers. And whatever solution we come up with, it's probably not going to if we have a fair system, it won't perpetuate those outliers and those grandfather situations. We need to recognize the reality of that. And that means some people are going to have to take some tough votes. And whenever possible, I would hope that you would contact those members and give them the political support they need to make a principled vote.
Well, these fellows need to get back to their respective caucuses to learn about the budget that's coming out,
Yes.
that we'll be talking about in future webinars. AWB is firmly committed to being part of the conversation on education funding and specifically the levy reform. We believe also that it is a critical part of addressing the clear decision and more importantly in making sure that we're reaching our educational funding goals. I hope you found today's information useful and helpful to understand why levy reform is a critical part of the education solution. Thank you, Representative Magendanz. Thank you, Senator Mullet. And for you that have questions that were not answered, just send me an email afterwards at amberc@awb.org, and we'll get those questions answered to you. Thank you for your time, and look forward to our future events.